כדי שתהיה מוכנה, ואז הוא...
לו, שומעת.
נכון? סבבה.
מה? כלום? אתה בסדר גם? אני בסדר. כי הזווית פה נותן לך את ה...
מה הוא רוצה להגיד? לצאת מהבתים, לא לצאת מהבתים, מיסטר טרור.
ג'ייפוס ציור פוש, שאומר you can't enjoy Israeli rights while declaring yourself Palestinian, שזה...
שטויות.
ממש harsh, בוא נגיד.
זה שטויות. freedom of speech. נדבר גם על זה, אם צריך.
Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visits the site of yesterday's attack in Tel Aviv as a manhunt continues for the gunman, confirmed as an Arab-Israeli citizen. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan says Israel and Turkey are in mutual need of one another in the region. And Saudi Arabia executes 47 people, including a prominent Shiite cleric, prompting tensions with Iran, where clerics say this may lead to the fall of the Saudi ruling family. Good evening. You're watching I-24 News here with extended coverage. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visits the site of the Tel Aviv attack this evening as new footage emerges from closed-circuit cameras showing the assailant just minutes before opening fire. A massive manhunt is still underway for the attacker responsible for Friday's shooting, which left 2 people dead and 7 wounded. Security officials were quoted as saying they believe the attacker, identified as 29-year-old Nashad Melchem, is still in the Tel Aviv area. Israeli police entered the family home in the Arab village of Arara today in a bid to gather more information. During the raid on the apartment, police confiscated a computer and arrested his brother for questioning. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke this evening upon visiting the site.
I appreciate the condemnation made by various fractions in the Arab public to this attack and expect the Arab members of Knesset to wholeheartedly condemn this incident as well. We all know there is a wild incitement by Islamic extremists against Israel in the mosques, schools, and on social media. We are determined to combat it firmly, as we did when the government decided to outlaw the Islamic Movement Northern Branch and the Murabitun movement. I will not tolerate two states within Israel, one which is law-abiding and the other with limited law enforcement, where illegal arms are common to be found and used time and time again in festivities and to execute criminal attacks. This era is over.
And we're now joined in studio by Amir Oren, Senior Defense Analyst for Haaretz Daily. Thank you, Amir, for being with us. We just heard Netanyahu's very harsh statements. I think it's maybe one of the first times he's visiting the site of in the recent wave of violence and making such harsh statements that could be seen as against an entire population living within Israel.
You're right. There are several reasons, or at least possible reasons for it. First of all, Israel is very much Tel Aviv-centric. The same act happening in Haifa or in a village would not have drawn such attention as being played out in the very heart of Israel's most liberal and open city. Jerusalem has some more population, but Tel Aviv is, of course, the bustling center of Israeli financial and cultural life. So,
and for many a red line, and for many a cynical red line, perhaps.
Yes, even though, of course, in the 90s we had several bombings not too far from there, down Dizengoff Street. The second point is that the police and the security agencies have up to now failed to apprehend the culprit. The manhunt, as he said, is going on, but still more than a day after the attack, he is nowhere to be seen. And the third point is that Netanyahu wants to shift the focus and perhaps the blame from whatever caused this specific act to something larger. And this is the Jewish-Arab pattern of life within Israel and what he calls incitement. And we know that for many years the police have pointed out, this has nothing to do with politics, that within Arab villages and towns there is a lot of lawlessness. People do not pay taxes, they do not get services to the same extent as Jewish citizens, but they don't get law and order to the same extent. They do hide and sometimes openly carry weapons. And this was the status quo. Apparently, what Netanyahu wants to do now is declare that there is an operation, that the police is going to raid Arab villages. This is going to be a mistake, because casualties will ensue, and this will do nothing to solve the terror problem, and of course, it will not solve the political problem.
Now we're going to get a quick update from Dizengoff, where our correspondent Danny Swibel is standing by. Danny, Prime Minister Netanyahu was just in the area, heightened security, even more heightened security with the Prime Minister. What can you tell us about the scene, about the security, and about the people who are coming to pay their respect?
Currently at the scene, Michal, there's, I would say, dozens and dozens, maybe even about 100 people who are gathered around trying to catch a glimpse of Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech. And as you can imagine, there's definitely stepped up security in the dozens, if not maybe 50 security members here, making sure that not only the Prime Minister is safe, but people alike. And the scene, when I first arrived here, definitely showed the resiliency of Tel Aviv people amidst very cold, rainy weather conditions and a killer still on the loose. People are out still en masse. People are out at cafes and coffee shops having a drink, having a coffee, and normal life does continue, though the people we spoke to earlier did say that they definitely still feel fearful walking around the neighborhood. Some neighbors around this area did hear the gunshots earlier, and they did see police running after what maybe perhaps either the assailant or just running to investigate a scene yesterday, and it was definitely a frightening scene that it could happen here in Tel Aviv. We're used to here in this country for a lot of attacks to occur, but Tel Aviv has always been off limits. Well, now that has changed. People are definitely fearful of, perhaps upcoming violence, but they continue to live their lives and go about their days. And here in nighttime in
And
Tel
Danny,
Aviv.
did you manage to speak maybe to some of the people passing by? We know that a lot of family members are visiting, but also, as you mentioned, some residents who weren't even in the area but feel very much affected by yesterday's attack.
People are definitely still frightened, especially that we do have an attacker still on the loose. But like I said, people are going about their day. There was actually scenes yesterday of scenes of glass broken on the ground. Well, that's all been cleaned up. All the definite residents that were affected by the violence or perhaps by a stray bullet that had broken windows has been cleaned up. All the windows have been replaced. So a lot of residents are seeing things return back to normal. Again, people are still skeptical to fully relax and let loose because, again, there is still somebody out on the loose that has not been apprehended. But people are trying to cope with this, as tends to be the case here in Israeli society, to just go and continue on with life despite, violent actions that have been happening against their society.
Thank you very much, Danny. We'll be back with you for more updates. Shock for the Tel Aviv residents.
But paradoxically enough, this is probably the safest place in Tel Aviv right now, because Netanyahu's bodyguards would not have let him visit the site if a gunman armed with a weapon would still be lurking somewhere there, learning from the media that Netanyahu is there. This is obviously a danger. So the one place he's probably not in is the place he attacked yesterday.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a security failure, perhaps, by the forces in Israel. They knew his identity shortly after the attack. The father was even very quick to turn him in after identifying him, and yet he's on the loose since yesterday. What are we to understand from this situation?
Well, this is an impossible situation, and one should not be too harsh on the authorities regarding the failure to put under surveillance everyone who was at any time in jail or punished for some minor infraction, because you would need 1 million police officers, 1 million Shin Bet officers to try and watch over 5 million citizens. This is impossible. And this should be considered not only a terror attack, but also a law enforcement problem. The motive notwithstanding, this is an attack. It could have been a random shooting. People should not be hysterical about it. Had it taken place in a city like Netanya, where criminal gangs have exchanged fire over the years, it wouldn't have made the headlines.
Absolutely. We'll speak about the motive soon, but first we're joined on the phone by our diplomatic correspondent, Tal Shalev. Tal, thanks for joining us. Bibi made some very harsh statements just now. What are the reactions from the political spectrum?
Well, Netanyahu used his visit to the site of the attack mainly to call on the Arab sector to be more cooperative with the rule of law. And he points the blame to incitement in the Arab sector. He says that he will not accept two states, one in which the rule of law is accepted and respected, and one in which incitement and weapons are freely used illegally. And he calls on the Muslim citizens of the states to accept the rule of law. And, of course, many of his political opponents have been attacking him in the past 24 hours, most notably Isaac Herzog, leader of the opposition, who today said that it's time for a new defense paradigm, that we are seeing lone terrorists, not organizations, and he calls for a diplomatic move. He says that Netanyahu is exhausted and doesn't have anything to offer. And we hear quite a harsh response to that statement from Netanyahu's own party, the Likud, who blasts Herzog for criticizing Netanyahu while the manhunt continues. And this event is, even though the motive is still unclear and the manhunt continues, is already sparking quite a vivid debate on the role and the involvement of Arab Israelis and incitement in the Arab sector. And the responses can be basically predicted in advance. We hear people on the right-wing side of the spectrum harshly criticize Arab MKs who have not yet, all of them, criticized this attack. And others on the other side of the spectrum, we hear left-wing leaders who say that this is time for a diplomatic move because it is seen that the government has not yet presented an adequate response to this latest wave of terror and violence. We should just note that the poll yesterday in Yediot Achronot, the widespread daily here in Israel, showed that 61% of Israelis feel that their sense of security has been eroded in the recent months, and 71% do not believe that the government has been acting in a satisfactory manner, and that definitely is in Netanyahu's mind as he gives these statements.
Thank you. Talan, is your first point, and as you mentioned in your first point, that Netanyahu is calling for more cooperation, but his family was in fact the first to cooperate, and it seems the village, Arara, where he comes from, is being extremely cooperative and the first to condemn these actions.
Oh, well, that is true, and we should note that Netanyahu did not call this the attack a terror attack. He called it a murder. He was regarding it as a crime, since it is clear that the motive is unclear. But Netanyahu, nevertheless, despite the fact that actually we did see quite an outstanding civilian responsibility coming from the family, he still uses this to tackle a widespread problem in the Arab sector, and that is the problem of illegal weapons and illegal arms. He did announce a new plan funding to boost law enforcement, and he called on Arab MKs to denounce it. There's also a growing debate in the Israeli political system about gun control issues. Amir Ohana, who was just a new member of parliament who was just sworn in this week from the Likud, yesterday called to actually expand the options of bearing guns, and we do know that the Interior Security Minister Gilad Erdan does intend to ease the gun restrictions, but at the same time, we are also hearing calls from the other side of the political spectrum, from the opposition, saying that this is the time to actually restrict guns, because we do see that the gun that the assailant used was actually, at the end of the day, probably, even though it did belong to his father, who was a volunteer in the Israeli police, the question is, will more guns on the streets actually restore the sense of security or lead to more violence because citizens will be taking the guns into their hands?
Of course, although in other cities, some will say that the fact that citizens did have guns helped stop attackers much quicker, whereas in this case, he's still at large. Thank you very much, Tal, for your insight. Meanwhile, Tel Aviv residents and families and friends of those killed also gathered at the scene of the attack, lighting candles in honor of those lost. The I-24 News Desk summarizes the shooting incident which rocked Tel Aviv.
A massive manhunt to track down the perpetrator of the New Year's Day shooting in Tel Aviv continued Saturday, the day after 2 people were killed and 7 wounded in the heart of Tel Aviv. The 2 young men who lost their lives in the attack were 30-year-old Shimon Ruimi and 26-year-old Alon Bakal.
My boy is dead. He wasn't an ordinary boy. He just finished his 4th year in law and business management. He was flourishing. He was a happy boy. He shone light wherever he went. He made everyone around him laugh.
Security camera footage and fingerprints led police to identify the assailant as a 29-year-old Israeli Arab from the northern region of Wadi Ara. Security forces were searching the Tel Aviv area for the suspect, but were also exploring the possibility that he had fled the metropolitan area, as well as scanning the village where his family lives.
Right now, our main task is to find the unknown perpetrator responsible for the shooting on Dizengoff 118. We're in a manhunt and an intensive investigation using all of the best resources that the Israeli police has in cooperation with whoever can help us with this probe.
According to media reports, his father saw the picture of the shooter caught on a security camera and called police. He told police that the attack was carried out using his gun, which his son stole. A senior security source revealed to I-24 News that the shooter had a criminal record and had previously spent 5 years in Israeli prison. The shooter's cousin was killed by Israeli police in 2006, an event which the family says plunged the suspect into depression. Members of the suspect's family described him as mentally deranged. In a separate incident that occurred just minutes after the deadly shooting on Friday, a taxi driver was shot to death in northern Tel Aviv. Police were investigating the circumstances of the killing. Meanwhile, Britain issued a travel warning for Israel, referring to the wave of terror attacks in Israel and the West Bank, which have been occurring on an almost daily basis for the past 3 months.
And we're still in studio with Amir Oren, senior defense analyst. So Netanyahu says he won't accept two states within a state.
Well, you know, on one level, this is an outrageous statement because there is already such a state within a state. It's in the West Bank. It's the settlers' state. They can do almost whatever they please. They are under Israeli jurisdiction, unlike their Palestinian neighbors. And the Israeli governments are beholden to the political forces which the settlers control. And of course, you are not going to see any operation, any raid on the settlers to confiscate illegally held weapons.
Which brings us to the issue of gun control. Could this become a politicized issue in Israel where everyone in the army bears guns, and after the army, especially settlers, but also in Jerusalem, many people have license to bear guns?
Yes, again, you can hear back and forth the same arguments over the years. When domestic violence goes to the level of husbands murdering their wives with legally held weapons, there is an outcry, and the Ministry of the Interior is asked to withdraw such licenses. Then there is a lull in such domestic incidents. You have a terror wave, and then you can hear those calls
praising for licenses.
For more guns.
Indeed.
All in all, it's not a plus because innocent bystanders are also being hurt by stray bullets. We have seen it over the last few months. Better for only trained marksmen to carry guns, and better for people not to be involved in such shootouts on the streets of Tel Aviv or Ra'anana or wherever.
Although in Israel there's a higher percentage of those who are trained and more people who have entered and exited the army, the Israeli forces.
But these are people who are carrying or used to carry rifles. You are not going to use a rifle or a submachine gun in a crowded street. Pistols, sidearms are another thing altogether. All police carry pistols, and they are best trained to do it. And only several elite units, which you are not going to find on any street, also carry pistols.
Or identify on any street.
So yes, so better leave it to the police.
Absolutely. We're going to go again to Dizengoff, where we'll get a live update from our correspondent, Danny Swibel. What's the latest?
Michal, since the last time we spoke, all the police barricades have slowly been removed and the police cars are just starting to pull away. This was after increased security after Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an address at the scene of the attack. And like I mentioned before, residents of Tel Aviv are starting to go about what could be considered a normal Saturday night here in town. People are going to cafes and restaurants en masse to have a drink right before the work week starts. And it's quite astounding, the people's fearlessness to go back, especially with the attacker still currently at large. So as it stands, the police security forces are still in search of the attacker. And residents here are going about their days. Some of the people I spoke to were witness to some of the scene earlier last night. They did hear some of the gunshots, and they did see several security forces chase. Whether it was the assailant or not was unsure, but they were witness to it, and it was very shocking because, again, Tel Aviv residents aren't used to seeing this kind of violence in town. We hear about it in other parts of the country, but Tel Aviv, for the most part, has been sheltered from these things. It's definitely put a fear in some people around here, but like I said, people are currently going about their day and going about their lives.
And Danny, are we seeing any opposition or people demonstrating against Netanyahu while he was speaking, before, after?
Nothing like that. People did want to catch a glimpse. And people, when they did finally listen to some of the speech, because definitely people are able to go to Twitter, find out what the Prime Minister had said, they do want to know when this will be brought to justice, how something like this could have happened, because there was information about this guy. This wasn't just some random lone wolf attack. This guy had a criminal record. So people were wondering how something like this could get through, how something like this could possibly occur, especially in the heart of Tel Aviv on one of the busiest days of the week here. And these questions are still open. And hopefully we will get answers, and people of Tel Aviv will get the answers sometime very soon.
And just a very quick question. Danny, we're seeing a bustling night behind you, very busy, as you said. Spirits seem to have returned to be their usual Tel Aviv nightlife spirit. However, the Simta club, which was the scene of the attack, can you still see the bullets? Are you able to see some signs of yesterday's attack other than the candles that were lit around it?
Well, the area has been cordoned off. I'm not sure if that's because Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke there earlier or it's part of the investigation scene, but that is cordoned off and we are not able to see inside. So that is being sheltered. But some of the other stores in the area that were affected by the shooting, including a restaurant that had all the glass shot out, has been completely replaced. So other than the specific scene of the attack that is cordoned off, everything looks completely back to normal. And again, is a testament to the resilience of Tel Aviv and Israeli society to clean up and move on with our lives here.
Thanks, Danny. So,
if one can judge by similar incidents in the past, tomorrow there will be the funeral for the manager of this club, and in respect, the place would probably only be reopened after the funeral, perhaps even some other days of mourning. But other than that, business will be back to normal. Another point regarding the investigation. It turns out, in all probability, that the attacker did not carry his cell phone. Otherwise, it would have been technologically feasible to find out where he is now, or at least where he threw his phone. The Shin Bet, which in a way donated one of its top officers to be the Inspector General of the police, has up to now not been excellent in its work, and this is a combined Shin Bet and police operation. Up to now, the results are mediocre.
Mediocre, although they are saying that residents can feel safe to leave their homes.
There are SWAT, special weapons and tactics teams, SWAT teams, as well as hostage negotiating teams at the ready once he is found. Perhaps if the attacker is going to be cordoned off somewhere and he will try to shoot at the police, there will be some sort of negotiation. But for that, you have to know where he is, which we don't.
Which it seems that there isn't a lead at the moment.
Not at the moment.
In the West Bank city of Hebron, hundreds march in a funeral procession for 17 Palestinian bodies retrieved from Israel. Yesterday, Israel handed over a total of 23 Palestinians killed during recent attacks on Israelis in an apparent bid to ease tensions. The IDF said its ambulances transferred the bodies to the Red Cross, which were then transferred to Palestinian hospitals for identification before being given to the families. Since a wave of violence erupted at the start of October, 138 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces, most of them while carrying out attacks on Israelis. Now, relations have been stuck between Israel and Turkey for nearly 5 years now. But today, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Israel is in need of a country like Turkey in the region and admitted that Turkey also needs Israel. His comments were made upon his return from a visit to Saudi Arabia. Israeli-Turkey relations have been tense since 2010 when Israeli forces raided the Mavi Marmara, a Gaza-bound flotilla, killing 10 activists on board. The two sides are still finalizing 2 out of the 3 conditions: compensation for the victims and the lifting or bending of an embargo on the Gaza Strip.
This is unprecedented rhetoric from Erdogan, at least in recent years. Signaling positive and encouraging developments are in the card for Jerusalem and Ankara. Erdogan also tells reporters that the reconciliation will be good for the Palestinians. He says that we will not solve Palestinian problems by shouting at each other. And last month, Israel did announce that it has reached understandings with Turkey that paved the way for reconciliation and normalization. Since then, both Jerusalem and Ankara have acknowledged that there are still hurdles to overcome, and the main obstacle at this point is the Turkish demand to lift the Gaza blockade. But Erdogan, speaking to reporters, says that Turkey wants to send a ship with electricity and construction supplies, and that Israel has agreed.
So, Amir, although there's a shift of normalized ties between Israel and Turkey, Erdogan's statements are unprecedented.
Yes, you can see the shift from total negativity towards some sort of compromise. And what Erdogan is basically saying, okay, don't lift the siege for everybody, lift the siege for Turkey. Let us, or let me personally, have the prestige of sending something to Gaza so that I can declare victory and go on with renewed relations.
And you can see it as a reversal almost from what happened during the Mavi Marmara.
Definitely.
Giving them now a special status.
At least this is their demand. If they get something which they can talk about as an achievement, there will be a compromise, because the monetary value, the $20 million, this was promised even 2 years ago, even though Netanyahu was under pressure from Avigdor Lieberman and others not to accept it. But this can also be signed on soon.
Miro, and thank you very much for being here with us this evening. Saudi Arabia executed 47 people on Saturday for charges of terrorism, including the prominent Shiite Muslim cleric Nimar al-Nimar. Shiite Iran has warned that executing Nimar would, quote, cost Saudi Arabia dearly, with some clerics saying this could lead to the fall of the Saudi royal family. Nearly 160 people were executed in Saudi Arabia in 2015, with beheadings reaching their highest level in 2 decades. I-24 News has more.
Saudi Arabia executed a prominent Shiite Muslim cleric, Sheikh Nimar al-Nimar, along with 46 other people for charges of terrorism on Saturday. The government said the executed included Sunnis convicted of involvement in deadly al-Qaeda attacks. The executions were an apparent message to both Sunni Muslim jihadists and Shiite anti-government protesters that the conservative Islamic kingdom won't tolerate violent dissent. The 56-year-old cleric, Nimar al-Nimar, was the driving force of the protests that broke out in 2011 in the Sunni-ruled kingdom's east, where the Shiite minority complains of marginalization. His execution has sparked protests, with dozens of Shiite Muslims marching in Saudi Arabia's village of Al-Awamiyah. Demonstrators chanted "Down with al-Saud," the name of the ruling Saudi family. The execution of Nimar is also expected to inflame already raging sectarian tensions across the Middle East. Shiite Iran has warned that the execution would cost Saudi Arabia dearly, with some clerics saying that this could lead to the fall of the Saudi royal family. Angry reactions also came from Shiites in Lebanon and Yemen, calling the Saudi action a grave mistake and pronouncing Nimar as a holy warrior. But Saudi Arabia stands firmly behind its actions.
We are totally confident in what we do and what we believe in. We do not pay attention to external points of view of our measures, whether on justice or the implementation of sentences.
The interference in judicial matters is unacceptable, and it is not possible to hear it because justice is a sovereign thing, and it is the right of the state to apply the rules and the legitimacy that rules our territory.
Nearly 160 people were executed in Saudi Arabia in 2015, with beheadings reaching their highest level in 2 decades.
The Saudi-led coalition that has been bombing Shiite Houthi movement in Yemen for 9 months announced the end to a ceasefire that began on December 15th, but was repeatedly violated by both sides. The Saudi press agency said the ceasefire had reportedly come to an end due to the continuous rebel fire of ballistic missiles towards Saudi cities, targeting Saudi border posts and hampering aid operations. And we're moving now to India, where security was stepped up both in New Delhi and the northwestern state of Punjab after a gunman attacked an Indian Air Force base on the border with Pakistan, leaving 2 guards killed and 4 gunmen dead. The assailants had earlier hijacked a police officer's car and driven it to the heavily guarded base. The attack comes 1 week after Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi made an impromptu visit to Pakistani counterpart Nawaz Sharif in an effort to revive bilateral talks that had previously been derailed by militant attacks.
We have started performing checks in Uttarakhand, keeping in mind that the militant attack was in Punjab, Pathankot. Intelligence agencies have been alerted and checks have started in the areas on the border with Uttar Pradesh and Himachal Pradesh.
And staying in India, but on a completely different note, where the odd-even plan to limit private cars in the capital, Delhi, began its 2-week trial on Friday, with January 1st being an odd-numbered date. Only odd-numbered vehicles were allowed on the roads. Today, only cars with even numbers are allowed to drive, but with the pollution in the city reaching such alarming levels, that may not be enough. More in the following report.
New Delhi's India Gate shrouded in smog. Air pollution here is often more than 10 times over recommended limits, making India's capital the most toxic city on earth.
In the early morning, you see a lot of smoke and fog there. It's pollution, air pollution. So because of that, I want the number of cars on the road to be reduced.
Children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable to the effects of unclean air, which include bronchitis, lung cancer, and heart disease. Countermeasures such as face masks and air purifiers are few and far between in this slum.
I don't send my children out to play. I don't want them to get a fever or a cough because of the dust.
In the evening, there are a lot of traffic jams, and that creates dust and smoke.
Diesel cars, garbage-burning construction, and coal-fired power stations all contribute to Delhi's dirty air, and it's an issue experts warn is spiraling out of control.
It's a public health concern, and when it's a public health concern, it also has an impact on economic growth. Air pollution now is one of the biggest killers of children in India, more than diarrhea.
Campaigners say Delhi's pollution could be responsible for up to 30,000 deaths each year. Enforced alternate driving days are one solution being put forward, with the hope that will help usher in a brighter and cleaner future for the next generation.
Al-Shabaab found a new and interesting figure to help recruit new members. It's none other than Donald Trump with his latest controversial remarks regarding Muslims in the United States. ABC News has the story.
Muslims of the West, take heed.
It's not from ISIS, but the Muslim extremist terror group Al-Shabaab. The Al-Qaeda arm in Somalia has posted a recruitment video using Donald Trump's famous vow to bar Muslims from traveling to the United States.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
The video is titled The Path to Paradise and encourages African Americans in the U.S. to convert to Islam and join the jihad. Trump's words are sandwiched between the recorded words of the U.S.-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed in a U.S. drone strike 4 years ago. He says the West will eventually turn on its Muslim citizens and seems to use Trump's words to support his premise. Hillary Clinton said ISIS would produce videos using Trump's Muslim travel ban as a recruiting tool. But until tonight, there had been no evidence of anything even close to that.
And moving to the U.S., where in his first weekly address for 2016, President Barack Obama said he will take unilateral action to tackle the problem of gun violence in the country. Obama added that he will use his executive powers as president since Congress has failed to address the problem.
A few months ago, I directed my team at the White House to look into any new actions I can take to help reduce gun violence. And on Monday, I'll meet with our Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, to discuss our options. Because I get too many letters from parents and teachers and kids to sit around and do nothing. I get letters from responsible gun owners who grieve with us every time these tragedies happen, who share my belief that the Second Amendment guarantees a right to bear arms, and who share my belief we can protect that right while keeping an irresponsible, dangerous few from inflicting harm on a massive scale.
Grammy-winning singer Natalie Cole, the daughter of Nat King Cole, has died at the age of 65, according to her family. The family statement said Cole died of ongoing health issues. While Cole was a Grammy winner in her own right, she had her greatest success in 1991 when she re-recorded her father's classic hits with him on the track for the album Unforgettable with Love. It became a multi-platinum smash and garnered her multiple awards, including Album of the Year. Cole died Thursday evening at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. And we'll recap our top story of the hour. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visits the site of the Tel Aviv attack this evening as new footage emerges from closed-circuit cameras showing the assailant just minutes before opening fire. A massive manhunt is still underway for the attacker responsible for Friday's shooting, which left 2 people dead and 7 wounded. Security officials were quoted as saying they believe the attacker, identified as 29-year-old Nashad Melchem, is still in the Tel Aviv area. Israeli police entered the family home in the Arab village of Arara today in a bid to gather more information. During the raid of the apartment, police confiscated a computer and arrested his brother for questioning. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke upon visiting the site.
I appreciate the condemnation made by various fractions in the Arab public to this attack and expect the Arab members of Knesset to wholeheartedly condemn this incident as well. We all know there is a wild incitement by Islamic extremists against Israel in the mosques, schools, and on social media. We are determined to combat it firmly, as we did when the government decided to outlaw the Islamic Movement Northern Branch and the Morabitun movement. I will not tolerate 2 states within Israel, one which is law-abiding and the other with limited law enforcement, where illegal arms are common to be found and used time and time again in festivities and to execute criminal attacks. This era is over.
And we're now going live to Dizengoff, where our correspondent Danny Swibel is standing by. Danny, Alon Bakal, the manager of the Simta pub who was killed, his funeral will be held tomorrow. And the Simta will, of course, be reopened only afterwards. Everything else in the city seems to be open. And we'll be back with Danny Swibel in just a few moments to tell us how residents in Dizengoff are reacting following yesterday's attack. Danny, are you with us? And we'll quickly move to sports before we go back. The Montreal Canadiens overwhelmed the Boston Bruins 5-1 in the NHL's annual outdoor winter classic on Friday at the Gillette Stadium outside of Boston. It was a great win for the visiting team, as the Bruins and the Canadiens hold a great rivalry, with both being 2 of the original 6 teams that made up the National Hockey League back in 1942. The Winter Classic is a game played outdoors, usually in a football or baseball field, and held for the first time in 2008. And we're going to recap our hour's top story. Prime Minister Netanyahu visited the site of yesterday's attack, where an assailant was, visited the site of the attack, where as new footage emerges from closed-circuit cameras showing the assailant minutes before he opened fire. The massive manhunt is still underway for the attacker responsible for the attack that left 2 people dead and 7 people wounded. Security officials were quoted as saying they believe the attacker, identified as 29-year-old Nashad Melchem, is still in the Tel Aviv area. Israeli police entered the family home in the Arab village of Arara today in a bid to gather more information. During the raid of the apartment, police confiscated a computer and arrested his brother for questioning. And that's all the time we have. Join us again at the top of the hour for more updates from the I-24 News Desk.
כדי שתהיה מוכנה, ואז
לו, שומעת.
נכון? סבבה.
מה הוא רוצה להגיד? לצאת מהבתים, לא לצאת מהבתים, מיסטר טרור.
ג'ייפוס ציור פוש, שאומר you can't enjoy Israeli rights while declaring yourself Palestinian, שזה
שטויות.
ממש harsh, בוא נגיד.
זה שטויות. Far from their down Dizengoff Street. The second point is that the police and the security agencies have up to now failed to apprehend the culprit. The manhunt, as he said, is going on, but still more than a day after the attack, he is nowhere to be seen. And the third point is that Netanyahu wants to shift the focus and perhaps the blame from whatever caused this specific act to something larger. And this is the Jewish-Arab pattern of life within Israel and what he calls incitement. And we know that for many years the police have pointed out, this has nothing to do with politics, that within Arab villages and towns there is a lot of lawlessness. People do not pay taxes, they do not get services to the same extent as Jewish citizens, but they don't get law and order to the same extent. They do hide and sometimes openly carry weapons. And this was the status quo. Apparently what Netanyahu wants to do now is declare that there is an operation, that the police is going to raid Arab villages. This is going to be a mistake, because casualties will ensue, and this will do nothing to solve the terror problem, and of course it will not solve the political problem.
Now we're going to get a quick update from Dizengoff, where our correspondent Danny Swibel is standing by. Danny, Prime Minister Netanyahu was just in the area, heightened security, even more heightened security. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visits the site of yesterday's attack in Tel Aviv as a manhunt continues for the gunman, confirmed as an Arab-Israeli citizen. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan says Israel and Turkey are in mutual need of one another in the region. And Saudi Arabia executes 47 people, including a prominent Shiite cleric, prompting tensions with Iran, where clerics say this may lead to the fall of the Saudi ruling family. Good evening. You're watching I-24 News here with extended coverage. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visits the site of the Tel Aviv attack this evening as new footage emerges from closed-circuit cameras showing the assailant just minutes before opening fire. A massive manhunt is still underway for the attacker responsible for Friday's shooting, which left 2 people dead and 7 wounded. Security officials were quoted as saying they believe the attacker, identified as 29-year-old Nashad Melchem, is still in the Tel Aviv area. Israeli police entered the family home in the Arab village of Arara today in a bid to gather more information. During the raid on the apartment, police confiscated a computer and arrested his brother for questioning. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke this evening upon visiting the site.
I appreciate the condemnation made by various fractions in the Arab public to this attack and expect the Arab members of Knesset to wholeheartedly condemn.
freedom of speech. נדבר גם על זה, אם צריך.
This incident as well. We all know there is a wild incitement by Islamic extremists against Israel in the mosques, schools, and on social media. We are determined to combat it firmly, as we did when the government decided to outlaw the Islamic Movement Northern Branch and the Murabitun movement. I will not tolerate two states within Israel, one which is law-abiding and the other with limited law enforcement, where illegal arms are common to be found and used time and time again in festivities and to execute criminal attacks. This era is over.
And we're now joined in studio by Amir Oren, Senior Defense Analyst for Haaretz Daily. Thank you, Amir, for being with us. We just heard Netanyahu's very harsh statements. I think it's maybe one of the first times he's visiting the site of in the recent wave of violence and making such harsh statements that could be seen as against an entire population living within Israel.
You're right. There are several reasons, or at least possible reasons for it. First of all, Israel is very much Tel Aviv-centric. The same act happening in Haifa or in a village would not have drawn such attention as being played out in the very heart of Israel's most liberal and open city. Jerusalem has some more population, but Tel Aviv is, of course, the bustling center of Israeli financial and cultural life. So,
and for many a red line, and for many a cynical red line, perhaps.
Yes, even though, of course, in the 90s we had several bombings not too